not the crisis of the whole affair. It chilled him with a deathly chill to think that Joy must have heard all the conversation between her father and himself. What a remembrance for her in all the empty years to come! What sorrow, what pain! Presently he heard behind him as he stood facing her a sound which was rather a groan than an ejaculation, a groan endowed with articulated utterance. Good God! Unconsciously he repeated the word under his breath, good God! Joy, with a fixed high-strung look, stepped down into the room. She stood beside Athlyne who, as she came close to him, turned with her so that together they faced her father. Colonel Ogilvy said in a slow whisper, the words dropping out one by one, "Have you been there all the time? Did you hear all we said?" She answered boldly, "Yes. I was there and heard everything." Again a long pause of silence, ended by Colonel Ogilvy's next question, "Why did you stay?" Joy answered at once. Her quick speech following the slow tension sounded almost voluble. "I could not get away. I wanted to, but there is no other door to the room. That is why I came out here when I woke. I could not get my boots which the maid had taken last night, and I wanted to get away as quickly as possible. And, father, being there, though I had to move about dressing myself, I could not help hearing everything." Her father had evidently expected that she would say something more, for as she stopped there he looked at her expectantly. There was a sort of dry sob in his throat. Athlyne stood still and silent. He hardly dared to breathe lest he should unintentionally thwart Joy's purpose. For with all his instincts he realized that she had a purpose. He knew that she understood her father and that she was the most potent force to deal with him, and knowing this he felt that the best thing he could do would be to leave her quite free and unhampered to take her own course. He kept his eyes on her face, gazing at her unwinkingly. Her face was fixed, not stern but set to a purpose. Somehow at that moment he began to realize how well he understood her. Without more help than his eyes could give him, he seemed to follow the workings of her mind. For her mind was changing. At the first her expression was of flinty fixedness, but as she continued to look at the old man it softened, and with the softening her intentioned silence gave way. Her lover's thoughts translated thus, "I will protect him against my father. He has threatened him, he is forcing him to death. I shall not help him by sparing him a pang, an awkwardness. And yet, why that? He is an old man, and my father. That white hair demands respect. He is angry, hard and untender now, but his life has been a tender one to me, and he is my father. Though I am determined to save my lover, my husband, I need not in the doing cause that white head to sink in shame. I can spare him the pang of what he may think ingratitude in me. And, after all, he has what must seem to him just cause of offense. He cannot, will not understand. He is brave and proud, and has a code of honor which is more than a religion. And he, my lover, my husband, is brave too. and as unyielding as my father. And he is willing to die for me. To die for me, my honor, my happiness. Though his dying is worse, far worse than death to me. But he is dying bravely, and I, that was to have been his wife, must die bravely, worthily too. If he can suffer and die in silence, so too must I. It seemed a natural sequence of thought when she said to her father, "Daddy, do you know you have not said a word to me yet? What have I ever done in my life that you should not trust me now? Have I ever lied to you that you cannot trust me to answer truly when you ask me anything? Why don't you ask me now? I know that things do not look well. I realize that you must have been shocked when you came into the room. But, Daddy dear, there are few things in the world that cannot be explained, at any rate in part. Don't forget that I am a woman now. I am no longer a child whose ignorance is her innocence. Speak to me. Ask me what you will, and I will answer you truly. Hear me, even as you would listen to one dying. For indeed it is so. If you carry out your intention, as I have heard it expressed, I shall no longer live, there will be nothing for me to live for. Do you mean that you will commit suicide? Said her father. Oh, no. I hope I have pluck enough to live, if I can. Do not fear for me, Daddy. I shall play the game full, as he will do. As she spoke, she pointed a finger at Athlyne. She felt now, and for the first time, acutely that she did not know what to call him before a third person, even her father. Athlyne looked relieved by her words. When she spoke of dying he had grown sadly white. He shared her father's apprehension. Colonel Ogilvy saw the change in his look, and took it ill. As may be surmised, a part of his anger towards Athlyne arose from jealousy. Until this man had appeared upon the scene his little girl was his alone, no other man shared in her affection. As she was an only child, all his parental affection had been centered in her. Though he might have been prepared to see her mate with a man of his own choosing, or at any rate of his acceptance, he was jealous of the man who had stepped in, unaccredited and wanting in deference to himself. It must have been a tinge of this jealousy which prompted his next question. Turning with a bitter formality to Athlyne he said, "I suppose you are satisfied, now, sir. Whatever may come, my daughter is estranged from me, and it is your doing." In answer Joy and Athlyne spoke together. Said the latter, "Oh sir." There he stopped. He feared to say more lest his anger should master him. But the protest was effective. The old man flushed, over forehead and ears and neck. Joy spoke in a different vein. "There is no estrangement, Daddy dear, and therefore it can be no one's doing. Least of all could such a thing come from this man who loves me, and whom I love." As she spoke she blushed divinely, and taking her lover's right hand between both her hands held it tight. This seemed for some reason to infuriate her father afresh. He strode forward towards Athlyne as though about to strike him. But at the instant there came a quick rap on the door. Instinctively he drew away, and, having called out "Come," stood expectingly and seemingly calm. The door opened slightly and the voice of the sheriff was heard. "May I come in? I am Alexander Fenwick, Sheriff of Galloway." As he was speaking he entered the room with a formal bow to each in turn. He continued to speak to Colonel Ogilvy. "You will pardon this intrusion, I hope, sir. Indeed, I trust you will not look upon it as an intrusion at all when you know the reason of my coming." Colonel Ogilvy's habit of old-fashioned courtesy came at once to the fore with the coming of a stranger. With a bow which to those reared in a newer and less formal school of manners seemed almost grandiloquent, he spoke. "I came here on some business, and on my arrival a few minutes ago was asked by our landlady, an old servant of my own, who on that account thought that she might ask what she thought a favor, to come up here. She thought, poor anxious soul, that some unpleasantness might be afoot as she heard high words, and feared a quarrel. All the more on account of a sudden arrival of a gentleman who seemed somewhat incensed. This I took from her description of the personality, to be you, sir. Indeed, I recognize all the points, except that of the anger." As he spoke he bowed with pleasant courtesy. The other bowed too, partly in answer to the implied question and partly in recognition of the expressed courtesy of the words and manner. Whilst he had been speaking, the sheriff had been watching keenly those around him. He had been for so long a time in the habit of forming his opinion rather by looks than words that the situation seemed to explain itself. Young lovers, angry father. This opinion was justified and sustained by the confidence which had been given to him by Athlyne on the previous afternoon. He had been, on entering the room, rather anxious at the state of affairs, but now he began to breathe more freely. He felt that his experience of life and of law might really be here of some service. But his profession had also taught him wariness and caution, also not to speak on side issues till he knew the ground thoroughly. Joy he read like an open book. There was no mistaking her love, her anxiety, her apprehension. Athlyne he knew something of already, but he now saw in his face a warning look which bade him be silent regarding him. He diagnosed Colonel Ogilvy as a proud, masterful, vain, passionate man, something of a prig, tender, in a way he understood himself, faithful to his word, relentless to an expressed intention, just, according to his own ideas of right and wrong. Weighing these attributes for his own pacific purposes, he came to the conclusion that his first effort at conciliation should be made with regard to the last mentioned. So he began, speaking in a manner of courtly and deferential grace. "I trust, sir, you will yield to me the consideration often asked by, and sometimes granted to a well-intentioned man, however bungling the same might be in thought or method or manner." Colonel Ogilvy conceded the favor with a gracious bow. Thus emboldened, if not justified, he went on, "I fain would ask that I might be allowed to make something in the nature of a short statement, and to make it without interruption or expostulation. You will understand why presently." Again the gracious acquiescence. He continued, "You are, I take it, a stranger to this country, though, if I am not misled by name and lineament, claiming Scottish forebears. Colonel Ogilvy's bow came more naturally this time. His inlying pride was coming to the rescue of common sense. The sheriff understood, and went on with better heart. The experience which I have had in the performance of my duties as sheriff has shewn me that such a group as I see before me, father, daughter and lover, if I mistake not, is not uncommon in this part of Scotland. No one answered his bow this time. All were grimly silent in expectancy. He felt that it was a dangerous topic, but the fact had been stated without being denied. He hurried on. Just across the border, as we have had very many occasions of runaway marriages. I have had myself in earlier days to explain for the good of all parties how the law stands in such matters. More than once the knowledge enabled those interested in it to spare much pain to others, generally to those whom they loved best. I trust that now I may use that knowledge in your behalf, as a friend. I am not here in my official capacity, or perhaps I might not be so free to advise as I am now without, I trust, offence to anyone. Colonel Ogilvy's gracious bow here answered for all the party. The sheriff felt more at ease. He was now well into his subject, and the most difficult part of his duty had been, he thought, past. All three of his hearers listened eagerly as he went on. A knowledge of the law can hurt no one, though it may now and again disappoint someone, when expounded too late. Well, there is a common belief in South Britain, and elsewhere that the marriage law in Scotland is a very filmy thing, with bounds of demarcation which are actually nebulous. This doubtless arises from the fact that all such laws are based on the theory that it is good to help such contracting parties to the secure and speedy fulfillment of their wishes. But anyone who thinks that they are loose in either purpose or action is apt to be rudely enlightened. The Scots marriage laws demand that there be a manifest and honest intention of marriage on the part of the contractors. This intention can be proved in many ways. Indeed, the law in certain cases is willing to infer it, when direct proof is not attainable, from subsequent acts of the parties. I may fairly say that in all such cases courts of law will hold that mutuality of intention is of the essence of marriage right. This followed by cohabitation is the marriage, though the latter to follow close on the declaration is not always deemed necessary. In our law the marriage may be either of two kinds. The most formal is that effected by a minister or proper official after due calling of banns, or by notice given to sheriff or registrar. The other form is by what is known in the law as irregular marriage. This is in legal parlance, for which I make no apology, as it is necessary that all married folk, or those intending to enter that honourable condition, should understand it, is known as intention followed by copula. Now you must know that either form of marriage is equally binding, equal in law and honour, and when the conditions attached to each form have been duly fulfilled, such marriage is irrefragable. In old days this facility of marriage made Gretna Green, which is the first place across the border, the objective for eloping lovers matrimonially inclined, and as till 1856 no previous residence in Scotland was required, romance was supposed to stop at the border. That is, the marriage could be effected and parental objections, did such exist, were overborne. There were many cynical souls who held that repentance for the hasty marriage could then begin. I feel bound to say that this is an opinion in which I do not myself share. In 1856 an Act of Parliament, 20th Vict. Cap. 96, was passed, by which it became necessary for the validity of irregular marriage that at least one of the two contractors should have his or her usual residence in Scotland, or have been resident in Scotland for 3 full weeks next preceding the marriage. I thank you, Colonel Ogilvy, for having listened to me so patiently. But as I have no doubt that you three have much to say to each other, I shall withdraw for the present. This will leave you free to discuss matters. And perhaps I may say, as an old man as well as a responsible officer of the law, that I trust the effect will be to make for peace and amity. I am staying here in the hotel and I shall take it as a great pleasure and a great honor if you will breakfast with me in say an hour's time. All your family will be most welcome. With a bow, in which deference and geniality were mingled, he withdrew. Each of the three left kept looking at each other in silence. Joy drew closer to Athlyne and took his hand. Colonel Ogilvy pretended not to notice the act, an effort on his part which made his daughter radiant with hope. The first words spoken were by the colonel, "That man is a gentleman." The two others felt that silence was present discretion. To agree with Colonel Ogilvy in his present mood was almost as dangerous as to disagree with him. His next words were in no way conciliatory, though the arrière-pensée made for hope. "Now, sir, what have you to say for yourself in this unhappy matter? Remember, I in no way relax my intention of punishment, but I am willing to hear what you have to say." Athlyne winced at the word punishment, which was not one which he was accustomed to hear applied to himself. But for Joy's sake he made no comment. He even kept his face fixed so as not to betray his anger. He felt that any change of subject, or drifting off that before them, must be for the better. Things could, he felt, hardly be worse than at present. Moreover, it might smooth matters somewhat if Colonel Ogilvy could be brought to recollect that he was not himself an undesirable person for alliance, and that his intention of matrimony had been already brought before Joy's father. In this conviction he spoke. As in this country, sir, intention counts for so much, may I crave your indulgence for a moment and refer you back to my letter to you on the subject of a very dear wish of mine, a wish put before you with a very decided intention. Colonel Ogilvy's answer, given in manner of equal suavity, was disconcerting. The bitterness behind it was manifest. "I think, sir, there must be some error, which is not mine. I never received any letter from you. Your epistolary efforts seem to have been confined to the ladies of my family." With an effort Athlyne restrained himself. When he felt equal to the task he spoke, still with a manner of utmost deference. "An error there surely is, but it is not mine either. I posted yesterday at the Ambleside post office a letter to you." He was interrupted by Colonel Ogilvy, who said bluntly, "I am not so sure, sir, that the fault of my not reading such a letter was not yours, though perhaps not in the direct manner you mean. When I arrived home last night and found the horrible state of things with regard to my daughter's rash act, due to you this with a look of actual malevolence, I was so upset that I did not look at the pile of letters awaiting me. I only read Joy's messages." As he said this, Athlyne's eyes flashed, and there was an answering flash in the eyes of the woman who looked so keenly at him. This was the first time since his arrival that the father had condescended to even mention his daughter's name. There might be some softening of that hard nature after all. Then the old man continued, "I put them in my pocket, here they are." Whilst he looked at the envelopes in that futile way that some people unused to large correspondence love, Joy said with an easy calmness which made her lover glance at her in surprise, "Daddy, hadn't you better read your letters now? We shall wait." The tone was so much that to which he was accustomed from her that he did not notice the compromising which would otherwise have inflamed him afresh. Drawing a chair close to one of the windows, he opened the letters and began to read. Athlyne and Joy, instinctively and with unity of thought, moved towards the other window which was behind him. There they stood hand in hand, their eyes following every movement of the old man. Joy did not know, of course, what was in the letter, but she had seen it before in the garden at Ambleside and when he had posted it before setting out on their motor ride. And so, piecing her information with the idea conveyed by her lover's recent words, she was able to form some sort of idea of its general import. A soft, beautiful blush suffused her face, and her eyes glistened as she stood thinking. In the effort of thought she recalled many sweet passages. She now understood in a vague way what was the restraining influence which had moved her lover to reticence during all those hours when he had tried to tell her of his love and his hopes without actually speaking words, the knowledge of which given without his consent would have incensed her father against him, and so wrought further havoc. So moved was she that Athlyne, whose eyes were instinctively drawn to her from the observation of her father, was amazed and not a little disconcerted. There must be some strange undercurrent of feeling in her which he could not understand. Joy saw the look on his face and seemed to understand. She raised to her lips the hand that she so strongly clasped in hers and kissed it. Then she raised a finger of her other hand and touched her lips. Thus reassured of her love and understanding, Athlyne followed with his eyes the trend of hers, and so together they continued to watch her father, trying to gather from his bearing some indication of his thoughts. Indeed, this was not a difficult matter. Colonel Ogilvy seemed to have lost himself in his task, and expressed his comments on what he read by a series of childlike movements and ejaculations. Athlyne, who knew what the letter contained, could apply these enlightening comments, and even Joy in her ignorance of detail could inferentially follow the text. Colonel Ogilvy did say a word of definite speech, but the general tendency of his comment was that of surprise, astonishment. When he had finished reading Athlyne's letter, it was the last of the batch, he sat for quite half a minute quite still and silent, holding the paper between finger and thumb of his dropped left hand. Then with a deep frown on his forehead he began to read it again. He was evidently looking for some passage, for when he had found it he stood up at once and turned to them. By this time Joy, warned by the movement, had dropped her lover's hand and now stood some distance away from him. The old man began, "Sir, there is a passage in a letter here which I understand to be yours. So far I must acknowledge that I have been wrong. You evidently did send the letter, and I evidently received it. Listen to this. Having heard in a roundabout way that there was a woman in New York who was passing herself off as my wife, I undertook a journey to that city to make investigation into the matter, and in order to secure the necessary secrecy as to my movements took for the time an assumed name, or rather used as Christian and surname two of those names in the middle of my full equipment which I do not commonly use. What does all that mean? No, do not speak. Wait and I shall tell you. You say the lady, woman you call her, took your name. For saying such a thing, and for the disrespect in her description as a woman, you will have to answer me. Either of them will cost you your life." Athlyne answered with a quiet, impressive dignity which helped in some degree to reassure Joy, who stood motionless in open-eyed wonder, her heart seeming to her as cold as ice at the horror of this new phase of danger. It was a veritable bolt from the blue, incomprehensible to her in every way. "Colonel Ogilvy, I regret I shall be unable to meet your wishes in this respect." As the old man looked astonished in his turn, he proceeded, "I already owe you a life on another count, and I have but one. But if I had 10 you should have them all. Could they in any way assuage the sorrow which it seems must follow from my thoughtless act? I have told you already that I shall freely give my life in expiation of the wrong I have, all unintentionally, done to your daughter and yourself. And if any means could be found by which it could add to Joy's happiness or lessen her sorrow, I should in addition and as freely give my soul." Colonel Ogilvy's reception of these words was characteristic of the man, as he took himself to be. He drew himself up to his full height and stood at attention. Then he saluted, and followed his salute with a grave bow. The soldier in him spoke first, the man after. Both Joy and Athlyne noticed with new hope that he allowed the speaking of her name to pass unchallenged as a further cause of offense. Presently, and in a new tone, he said, "I have taken it for granted from the allusions in your letter that you are the writer, and from your mentioning an alias have not been surprised at seeing a strange name in the signature. But I have been and am surprised at the familiarity from a man of your years to a man of mine of a mere Christian name." It was now Athlyne's turn to be surprised. "A Christian name," he said with a puzzled pucker of his brows. "I am afraid I don't understand." Then a light dawning on him he said with a slight laugh, "But that is not my Christian name." "Then your surname?" queried the colonel. "Nor my surname either." His laugh was now more pronounced, more boyish. "Oh, I see, still another alias." The words were bitter, the tone of manifest offense. Athlyne laughed again, It was not intentional but purely spontaneous. He was recalled to seriousness by the look of pain and apprehension on Joy's face and by the Colonel's angry words, given with a look of fury. "I am not accustomed to be laughed at, and to my face Mr. Richard Hardy Athlyne etc." His apology for inopportune mirth was given with contrition, even humbly. "I ask your pardon, Colonel Ogilvy, very deeply, very truly. But the fact is that Athlyne is my proper signature, though it is neither Christian name nor surname. I do hope you will attribute my rudeness rather to national habit than to any personal wish to wound. Surely you will see that I would at least be foolish to transgress in such a direction, if it be only that I aim at so much that it is in your power to grant." There was reason in this which there was no resisting. Colonel Ogilvy bowed. He felt that he could do no less. Athlyne wisely said no more. Both men regarded the incident as closed. With Joy it was different. The incident gave her the information she lacked for the completion of the circle of her knowledge. As with a flash she realized the whole secret, that this man who had saved her life and whom now her father wanted to kill was none other than the man whose name she had taken, at first in sport and only lately in order to protect herself from troubles of inquisitiveness and scandal. At the moment she was in reality the only one of the three, the only one at all, who had in her hand all the clues. Neither her father nor Athlyne knew that she had given to the maid at the hotel a name other than her own. She began to have also an unconscious knowledge of something else. Something which she could not define. Some intuition of some coming change, something which hinged on her giving of the name. Now, for the first time she realized how dangerous it may be for anyone to take the name of any other person, for any purpose whatever, or from any cause. She could not see the end. But though her brain did not classify the idea, her blood did. She blushed so furiously that she had serious thoughts of escaping from the room. Nothing but the danger which might arise from such a step kept her in her place. But something must, she felt, be done. Things were so shaping towards reconciliation that it would be wise to prevent matters slipping back. For an instant she was puzzled as to what to do, then an inspiration came to her. Turning to her father she said, "Daddy, let us ask the old sheriff to come in again." She felt that she could rely on his discretion, and that in his hands things might slide into calmer waters. Her father acquiesced willingly, and a courteous message was sent through a servant. Chapter XXI. Application of law. Whilst the servant was gone there was a great clatter of arrival of a motor at the hotel, but all in Athlyne's room were too deeply concerned with their own affairs to notice it. Presently there was a light tap at the door, and the sheriff's "May I come in?" was heard. Colonel Ogilvy went himself to the door and threw it open. Beside the sheriff stood a lady, heavily clad and with a motor veil. "Joy, Joy," said the veiled figure, and Aunt Judy stepping forward took the girl in her arms. In the meantime the sheriff was explaining the situation. "I was just coming from my room in obedience to your summons, when this lady entered the hall. She was asking for you, Colonel, and for Miss Ogilvy, as who she had learned at the railway station, was stopping here. I ventured to offer my services, and as she was coming up here, undertook to pilot her. Joy was delighted to see Judy. She had so long been accustomed to look with fixed belief on her love and friending that she now expected she would be able to set matters right. Had she had any doubt of her aunt's affection, such must have soon disappeared in the warmth of the embrace accorded by her. When this was concluded, which was soon, for it was short, if strenuous, she turned to Colonel Ogilvy and held out her hand. "Good morning, Lucius. I see you got here all right. I hope you had a good journey." Then turning to Athlyne she said, as if in surprise, "Why, Mr. Hardy, how are you? And how do you come to be here? We thought we were never going to see you again." Then she rattled on. It was evident to Joy, and to Colonel Ogilvy also, that she was purposeful to baffle comment by flow of her own speech. "Lucius, you must thank this gentleman who is, as the landlady whispered to me, the sheriff of somewhere or other. He's a nice man, but a funny sort of sheriff. When I asked him where was his posse, he didn't know what I meant." Here she was interrupted by the sheriff, who said with a low bow to her, "It is enough for any man, dear lady, to be in such a charming presence." Judy did not comprehend the joke, but she knew, being a woman, that some sort of compliment was intended, and, being a woman, beamed accordingly. "Thank you, sir, both for your kindness in helping me and for your pretty talk. Joy, I have brought your dressing bag and a fresh rig out. You must need them, poor dear. Now you must tell me all your adventures. I told them to bring the things presently to your room. I shall then come with you whilst you are changing. Now, Mr. Sheriff, we must leave you for a little, but I suppose that as you have to talk business, you told me they had sent for you, you will doubtless prefer to be without us." "Your pardon," said the sheriff gracefully. "I hope the time will never come when I shall prefer to be without such charming company." This was said with such a meaning look, and in such a meaning tone, that Judy colored. Joy, unseen by the others, smiled at her, rejoicing. The sheriff, thinking they were moving off, turned to the colonel saying, "Now, Colonel Ogilvy, I am at your disposal, likewise such knowledge of law and custom as I possess." He purposely addressed himself to Colonel Ogilvy, evidently bearing in mind Athlyne's look of warning to silence regarding himself. Whilst he had been speaking, Joy stood still, holding Judy by the hand and keeping her close to her. Judy whispered, holding her mouth close to her ear and trying to avoid the observation of the others, "Come away, dear, whilst they are talking. They will be freer alone." Joy whispered in return, "No, I must not go. I must stay here, I am wanted." "Do not say anything, dear, not a word, but stay by me." Judy in reply squeezed her hand and remained silent. Colonel Ogilvy, with manifest uneasiness and after clearing his throat, said to the sheriff, "As you have been so good, sir, as to tell me some matters of law, and as you have very kindly offered us other services, may I trespass on your kindness in enlightening me as to some matters of fact?" The sheriff bowed. He continued, "I must crave your indulgence, for I am in some very deep distress, and possibly not altogether master of myself. But I need some advice, or at any rate enlightenment as to some matters of law. And as I am far from home and know no one here who is of legal authority, except yourself this Witherbow, I shall be deeply grateful if I may accept your kindness and speak to you as a friend." Again the sheriff bowed, his face beaming. Colonel Ogilvy, with a swift, meaning glance at each of the others in turn, went on, "I must ask you all to keep silent. I am speaking with this gentleman for my own enlightenment, and require no comments from any of you. Indeed, I forbid interruption." Unpromising as this warning sounded, both Joy and Athlyne took a certain comfort from it. The point they both attached importance to was that Athlyne was simply classed with the rest without differentiation. The sheriff, who feared lest the father's domineering tone might provoke hostilities, spoke quickly, "Now, Colonel Ogilvy, I am at your disposal for whatever you may wish to ask me. I suppose, Mr. Sheriff, I need not say, that I trust you will observe honorable silence regarding this whole painful affair, as I expect that all present will." This was said with a threatening smile. When the sheriff bowed acceptance of the condition, he went on, "Since you spoke to us here a little while ago, a strange enlightenment has come to me. Indeed, a matter so strange and so little in accord with the experiences of my own life that I am in a quandary. I should really like to know exactly how we all stand at present. From what you have said about the Scottish marriage laws, I take it that you have an inkling of what has gone on. And so, as you are in our confidence, you will not perhaps mind if I confide further in you. I shall be deeply honored, Colonel Ogilvy." "Thank you again, sir. You are a true friend to a man in deep distress and in much doubt. We are, as you perhaps know, Americans. My daughter's life was saved by a gentleman in New York. I think it right to say that it was on his part a very gallant act, and that we were all deeply grateful to him. He came to my house, at my own invitation, and my wife and her sister, Miss Judith Hayes," the sheriff turned to Judy and bowed as at an introduction, she curtsied in reply, "were very pleased with him. But we never saw him again. He returned very soon afterwards to England, and though we were coming to London he never came near us. Indeed, his neglect was marked, for though I invited him to call, he ignored us." As he said this he looked straight at Athlyne with hard eyes. "I have reason to know that my daughter was much interested in him. Ordinarily speaking, I should not mention a matter of this kind. But as I have received from him, it has only been made known to me in the interval since our meeting, an assurance of his affection and a proffer of marriage, I feel that I may speak." He turned away and began walking up and down the room as though trying to collect his thoughts. As Joy heard him speak of her own interest in the man and of his proposal of marriage, she blushed deeply, letting her eyes fall. But when, by some of the divine instinct of love, she knew that he was looking ardently at her. She raised them, swimming, to his. And so once more they looked deep into each other's souls. Judy felt the trembling of the girl's hand and held it harder with a sympathetic clasp, palm to palm and with fingers interlaced. She felt that she understood, and her eyes, too, became sympathetically suffused. The sheriff had now no eyes except for Judy. Whilst the colonel had been speaking he had looked at him. Of course, he knew well that it would be a cause of offence if he did not. But the walking up and down gave him opportunity for his wishes. Judy could not but recognize the ardor of his glance, and she too blushed exceedingly. Somehow, she was glad of it. She knew that blushing became her, and she felt that she would like to look her best to the eyes of this fine, kindly old man. When Colonel Ogilvy began to speak again there was a change in him. He seemed more thoughtful, more cautious, more self-controlled. Altogether he was more like his old self. There was even a note of geniality in his voice. "What I want to ask you in especial is this: how can we avoid any sort of scandal over this unhappy occurrence? My daughter has acted thoughtlessly in going out alone in a motor with a gentleman. Through a series of accidents it appears that that ride was unduly and unintentionally prolonged, and ended in her being caught in a fog and lost. By accident she came here, walking after the motor had broken down. She slept last night in that room, and the man, who had also found his way hither later, slept, unknowing of her proximity, in this. I need not tell you that such a state of things is apt to lead to a scandal. Now, and now only, is the time to prevent it." He was interrupted by the sheriff, who spoke hurriedly, as one who had already considered the question and had his mind made up. "There will be no scandal." He spoke in so decided a way that the other was impressed. "How do you know? What ground have you for speaking so decidedly?" "It rests entirely on you, yourself, Colonel Ogilvy." "What?" His tone was laden with both anger and surprise. "Do you think I would spread any ill report of my own daughter?" "Sir, you must," once more the sheriff cut into his speaking, "you misapprehend me, Colonel Ogilvy. You misapprehend me entirely." "Why should I? How could I think such a thing?" "No. I mean that if you accept the facts as they seem to me to be, no one, not you, nor anyone else, can make scandal, if you do not." "Explain yourself," he interrupted. "Nay, do not think me rude," here he put up a deprecating hand, "but I am so deeply anxious about my daughter's happiness, her future welfare and happiness," he added as he remembered how his violent attitude had, only a few minutes ago, imperiled, almost destroyed, that happiness. Joy had been, off and on, whispering a word to her aunt so that the latter was now fairly well posted in the late events. Quite so, my dear sir." "Most natural thing in the world," said the sheriff soothingly. "Usual thing under the circumstances is to kill the man, or want to kill him." As he spoke he looked at Athlyne meaningly. The other understood and checked the words which were rising to his lips. Then, having tided over the immediate danger of explosion, the sheriff went on, "The fact is, Colonel Ogilvy, that the series of doings, and perhaps misdoings, and accidents, which have led to our all meeting here and now, has brought about a strange conclusion. So far as I can see," here his manner grew grave and judicial, "these two young people are at the present moment man and wife, lawfully married according to Scottish law." The reception of this dictum was varied. Colonel Ogilvy almost collapsed in overwhelming amazement. Joy, blushing divinely, looked at her husband adoringly. Athlyne seemed almost transfigured and glorified. The realization of all his hopes in this sudden and unexpected way showed unmistakably how earnest they had been. Judy, alone of all the party, was able to express herself in conventional fashion. This she did by clapping her hands and then by kissing the whole party, except the sheriff, who half stood forward as though in hope that some happy chance might include him in the benison. She began with Joy and went on to her brother-in-law, who accepted with a better grace than she feared would have been accorded. When she came to Athlyne she hesitated for a moment, but with a now or never rush completed the act, and fell back shyly with a belated timorousness. The sheriff, having paused for the completion of this little domestic ceremony, went on calmly, "Since I left you a few minutes ago I have busied myself with making a few necessary inquiries from my old servant Jane McBean, now Macpherson. I made them, I assure you, Colonel Ogilvy, very discreetly. Even Jane, who is in her way a clever woman, has no suspicion that I was even making inquiry. The result has been to confirm me in my original conjecture, which was to the effect that there has been executed between these two people an irregular marriage." At the mention of the words the colonel exploded, "God's death, sir, the women of the Ogilvies don't make irregular marriages." The sheriff went calmly on, only noticing the protest for the sarcasm of answering it. By this time Joy and Judith were close together, holding hands. Insensibly the girl drew her aunt over to where Athlyne was standing and took him by the arm. He raised his other hand and with it covered the hand that lay on his arm, pressing it closer as he listened attentively to the sheriff's expounding of the law. "I gather that I did not express myself clearly when a short time ago I spoke of the Scottish marriage laws. Let me now be more precise. And as I am trying to put into words understandable by all a somewhat complex subject, I shall ask that no one present will make any remark whatever till this part of my task has been completed. I shall then answer to the best of my power any question or questions which any of you may choose to ask me. Let me begin by assuring you all that what in Scottish law we call an irregular marriage is equally binding in every way with a regular marriage. The word only refers to form or method, and in no wise to the antecedents or to the result. In our law, mutual consent constitutes marriage. You will observe that I speak of marriage, not the proof of it. Proof is quite a different matter, and as it is formally to be certified by a court, it is naturally hedged in by formalities. This consent, whether proved or not, whether before witnesses or not, should of course be followed by cohabitation, but even this is not necessary. The dictum of Scots law is consensus non concubitus facit matrimonium. But I have a shrewd suspicion that the mind of the court is helped to a declaration of validity when consensus has been followed by concubitus. Now let us take the present case and examine it as though testing it in a court of law, for such is the true means to be exact. This man and woman, we don't know gentleman and lady in the law, declared in the presence of witnesses that they were man and wife. That is, the man declared to the police sergeant at Dalry that the woman was his wife, and the woman declared timeously to the police officer who made the arrest that the man was her husband. These two statements, properly set out, would in themselves be evidence not only of inferred consent by declaration de praesenti but of the same thing by habit and repute. The law has been thus stated. It may be held that a man and a woman, by living together and holding themselves out as married persons, have sufficiently declared their matrimonial consent, and in that case they will be declared to be married although no specific promise of marriage or of de praesenti acknowledgement has been proved. But there is a still more cogent and direct proof, should such be required. Each of these consenting parties to the contract of marriage by consent on coming separately to this hotel last night gave to the servant of the house who admitted them the name by which I hold they are now bound in honourable wedlock. He spoke the last sentences gravely and impressively after the manner of an advocate pressing home on a jury the conclusion of an elaborate train of reasoning. Whilst speaking he had kept his eyes fixed on Colonel Ogilvy, who unconsciously took it that an exhortation on patience and toleration was being addressed to him. The effect was increased by the action of Joy, who seeing him all alone and inferring his spiritual loneliness, left Judith but still holding Athlyne's arm drew the latter towards him. Then she took her father's arm and stood between the two men whom she loved. Judy quietly took Athlyne's other arm, and so all stood in line holding each other as they faced the sheriff. No one said a word, all were afraid to break the silence. We now come to further proofs if such be required. The woman, who arrived first, gave the name of Lady Athlyne. Here Joy got fearfully red. She was conscious of her father's eyes on her, even before she heard him say, "That foolish joke again. Did not I forbid you to use it, daughter?" She felt it would be unwise to answer, to speak at all just at present. In desperation she raised her eyes to the face of her lover, and was struck with a sort of horrified amazement. For an instant it had occurred to him that Joy must have known his identity, for some time past at all events. The thought was, however, but momentary. Her eyes fell again quickly, and she stood in abashed silence. There was nothing to do now but to wait. The calm voice of the sheriff went on, like the voice of doom. The man arrived later. He himself had wired in his own name for rooms, but by the time he had arrived the possibility of his coming had, owing to the fog, been given up. The other traveller had been given the bedroom, and he slept on the sofa in the sitting room, this room. As he spoke, he went over to the door of communication between the rooms and examined the door. There were no fastenings except the ordinary latch, neither lock nor bolt. He did not say a word, but walked back to his place. Judy could not contain her curiosity any longer. She blurted out, "What name did he give?" The sheriff looked at her admiringly as he answered, "The name he gave, dear lady, was Athlyne." "Is that your name?" she queried, this time to Athlyne. "It is." He pulled himself up to his full height and stood on his dignity as he said it. His name should not be dishonored if he could help it. Colonel Ogilvy stood by with an air of conscious superiority. He already knew the name from Athlyne's letter, though he had not up to that moment understood the full import of it. He was willing to be further informed through Judy's questioning. "And you are Lord Athlyne, the Earl of Athlyne?" "Certainly." To the astonishment of every one of the company, Judy burst into a wild peal of hysterical laughter. This closely followed a speech of broken utterance which only some of those present understood at all, and of those some only some few partly. "Athlyne! Kill him for it! Calling herself by his name, oh, oh! Ahh!" There was a prolonged screech and then hysterical laughter followed. At the first, this unseemly mirth created a feeling of repulsion in all who heard. It seemed altogether out of place, in the midst of such a serious conversation, when the lives and happiness of some of those present were at stake, to have the train of thought broken by so inopportune a cachinnation was almost unendurable. Colonel Ogilvy was furious. Well was it for the possibilities of peace that his peculiar life and ideas had trained him to be tolerant of woman's weakness, and to be courteous to them even under difficulties. For had he given any expression to his natural enough feelings, such would inevitably have brought him into collision, intellectual if not physical, with both Athlyne and the sheriff, and either was to be deplored. Joy was in her heart indignant, for several reasons. It was too hard that, just as things were possibly beginning to become right and the fine edge of tragedy to be turned, her father's mind should be taken back to anger and chagrin. But far beyond this, on the side of evil, was the fact that it imperiled afresh the life of the man she loved, her husband. Even the personal aspect to her could not be overlooked. The ill-timed laughter prevented her hearing more of the man who it now seemed was already her husband. However, she restrained and suppressed herself and waited, still silent, for the development of things. But she did not consider looks as movements. She raised her eyes to Athlyne's adoringly, and kept them there. He in turn had been greatly upset for the moment. Even now, whilst those wild peals of hysterical laughter continued to resound, he could not draw any conclusions from the wild whirl of inchoate thoughts. There was just one faint gleam of light which had its origin rather in instinct than reason, that perhaps the interruption had its beneficial side which would presently be made manifest. When Joy looked towards him, there was a balm for his troubled spirit. In the depths of her beautiful eyes he lost himself, and his doubts and sorrows, and was content. The only one unmoved was the sheriff. His mental attitude allowed him to look at things more calmly than did those personally interested. With the exception of one phase, that of concern that this particular woman, who had already impressed her charming personality on his heart, should be in such distress, he could think, untroubled, of the facts before him. With that logical mind of his, and with his experience of law and the passions that lead to law invoking, he knew that the realization of Athlyne's name and position was a troublesome matter which might have been attended with disastrous consequences. To a man of Colonel Ogilvy's courage and strong passion, the presence of an antagonist worthy of his powers is rather an incentive to quarrel than a palliative. As to poor Judy, she was in no position to think at all. She was to all practical intents, except for the noise she was occasionally making, her transport was subsiding, as one who is not. She continued intermittently her hysterical frenzy, to laugh and cry, each at the top note, and commingling eternally. She struggled violently as she sat on the chair into which she had fallen when the attack began. She stamped her heels on the floor, making a sound like gigantic castanets. The sound and restless movement made an embarrassing milieu for the lucid expression of law and entangled facts, but through it all the sheriff, whose purpose after all was to convince Ogilvy, went on with his statement. By this time Joy, and Athlyne, whom with an appealing look she had summoned to help, were endeavoring to restore Judy. One at either side they knelt by her, holding her hands and slapping them and exercising such other ministrations as the girl out of her limited experience of such matters could, happily to soothing effect, suggest. The sheriff's voice, as calm voices will, came through the disturbance seemingly unhindered. Thus you will note that in all this transaction the Earl of Athlyne had made no disguise of his purpose. To the police who arrested him he at once disclosed his identity, which the sergeant told me was verified by the name on his motor driver's license. He telegraphed to the hotel by his title, as is fitting and usual, and he gave his title when he arrived. As I have already said, he stated to the police, at first on his own initiative and later when interrogated directly on the point, that the woman in the motor was his wife. And the identity of the woman in the motor and the woman in the hotel can easily be proved. Thus on the man's part there is ample evidence of that matrimonial purpose which the law requires. All this without counting the letter to the woman's father, in which he stated his wish and intention to marry her. Now as to the woman, and I must really apologize to her for speaking of the matter in her presence. Here Athlyne interrupted his ministrations with regard to Judy in order to expostulate. "Oh, I say, Mr. Sheriff. Surely it is not necessary." But the sheriff shut him up quite shortly. He had a purpose in so doing. He wished in his secret heart to warn both Athlyne and Joy not to speak a word till he had indicated that the time had come for so doing. "There is nothing necessary, my lord, except that both you and the young lady should listen whilst I am speaking. I am doing so for the good of you both, and I take it as promised that neither of you will say a single word until I have told you that you may do so." "Quite right, This was said sotto voce by Colonel Ogilvy. You, young madam, have taken upon yourself the responsibilities of wifehood, and it is right as well as necessary that you understand them, such of them at least as have bearing upon the present situation. As to the woman, she, when questioned by the police as to her status for the purpose of verification of Lord Athlyne's statement, accepted that statement. Later on, she of her own free will and of her own initiative, gave her name as Lady Athlyne, only the bearer of which could be the wife of the defender, I mean of Lord Athlyne. The interruption this time came from Colonel Ogilvy. If Lord Athlyne is defender, who is the other party? Lady Athlyne, or Miss Ogilvy, in whichever name she might take action, would be the pursuer. Sir, thundered the Colonel, going off as usual at half-cock, do you insinuate that my daughter is pursuer of a man? He grew speechless with indignation. The sheriff's coolness stood to him there, when the fury of the Kentuckian was directed to him personally. In the same even tone he went on speaking, I really must ask that you do not be so hasty in your conclusions whilst I am speaking, Colonel Ogilvy. You must understand that I am only explaining the law, not even giving any opinion of my own. The terminology of Scots law is peculiar, and differs from English law in such matters. For instance, what in English law is plaintiff and defendant becomes with us pursuer and defender. There may be a female as well as a male pursuer. Thus on the grounds of present consent, as there is ample proof of matrimonial consent of either and both parties, sufficient for either to use against the other, I take it that the court would hold the marriage proved, unless both parties repudiated the intent. This I am sure would never be, for if there were any mutual affection neither would wish to cause such gossip as would inevitably ensue. And if either party preferred that the union should continue, either from motives of love or interest, the marriage could be held good. And I had better say at once, since it is a matter to be considered by any parent, that should there have been any valid ground for what you designate as scandal, such would in the eyes of the law be only the proper and necessary completion of the act of marriage. And let me say also that the fact of the two parties, thus become one by the form of irregular marriage, having passed the night in this suite of rooms without bolt of fastening on the connecting door, would be taken by a court as proof of consummation. No matter by what entanglement of events, no matter how or by what accident or series of accidents the two parties came into this juxtaposition. There is but one other point to be considered regarding the validity of this marriage. It is that of compliance with the terms of Lord Brougham's Act of 1856. The man has undoubted domicile in Scotland for certain legal purposes. But the marriage law requires a further and more rigid reading of residence than mere possession of estates. The words are that one of the parties to the marriage must have his or her usual place of residence in this country. But as I have shown you that in Lord Athlyne's case his living in Scotland for several weeks in one or other of his own houses would be certainly construed by any court as compliance with the Act, I do not think that any question of legality could arise. Indeed, it is within my own knowledge that as a Scottish peer, Baron of Sea and the Shale, who declared Scottish domicile on reaching his majority and whose domicile of origin was not affected by his absence as an officer in foreign service, his status for the purpose of Scottish marriage is unassailable. In fine, let me point out that I am speaking altogether of proof of the marriage itself. The actual marriage is in law the consent of the parties, and such has undoubtedly taken place. The only possible condition of its nullity would be the repudiation of the implied consent by both of the parties. One alone would not be sufficient. And now, Colonel Ogilvy, as I believe it will be well that you and the two young people should consider the situation from this point of view, will you allow me to withdraw, still on the supposition that you will join me later at breakfast? And if this merry lady, pointing to Judy who had gained composure sufficiently to hear the end of his explanation, will honor me by coming to my sitting room, just below this, where breakfast will be served, it may perhaps be better. I take it that you will be all able to speak more freely, you and your daughter, and her husband. He withdrew gracefully, giving his arm to Judy who, having risen bashfully, had taken his extended arm. She was blushing furiously. The door closed behind him, leaving Joy standing between her father and Athlyne, and holding an arm of each. Chapter XXII. The hatchet buried. For a few minutes there was silence in the room, silence so profound that every sound of the street was clearly heard. Even the shutting of the sheriff's door in the room below was distinct. The first to speak was Colonel Ogilvy. Athlyne, who would have liked to break the silence, refrained through prudence. He feared that were he to speak before Colonel Ogilvy did, that easily irate gentleman might take offense. He knew that this might be disastrous, for it would renew the old strife in an acute form. As it was, there were distinct indications of coming peace. Joy, and joy alone, was to be thought of now. By this time Athlyne was beginning to get the measure of Colonel Ogilvy's foot. He realized that the dictatorial, vindictive, bloodthirsty old man would perhaps do much if left to himself, but that if hindered or thwarted or opposed in any way his pride or his vanity, and they were united in him, would force him to keep his position at any cost. Well, sir. The tone was so peremptory and so superior that any man to whom it had been used might well have taken offense, but Athlyne was already schooled to bear, and moreover the statement made by the sheriff filled his heart with such gladness that he felt that he could bear anything. As Joy was now his wife, he could not quarrel with her father, nor receive any quarrel from him. Still, all the same, he felt that he must support and maintain his own independent position. Such would be the best road to ultimate peace. Moreover, he had his own pride, and as he had already made up his mind to die if need be for Joy's sake, he could not go back on that resolution without seeming to be disloyal to her. There could be no hiding anything from her, as she had already heard the whole of the quarrel and of his acquiescence to her father's challenge. No one, however, would have thought he had any quarrel who heard his reply, spoken in exquisitely modulated accents of respect. Need I say, Colonel Ogilvy, that I am equally proud and happy in finding myself allied with your house by my marriage with your daughter. For, sir, I love her with all my soul, as well as with all my heart and mind. She is to me the sweetest, dearest and best thing in all the universe. I am proud of her and respect her as much as I love her, and to you, her father, I hope I may say that I bless, and shall ever bless for so long as I live, the day that I could call her mine. As he spoke, Joy's hand on his arm, which had trembled at the beginning, now gripped him hard and firmly. Turning his eyes to hers, he saw in them a look of adoration which made his heart leap and his blood seem on fire. The beautiful eyes fell for an instant as a red tide swept her face and neck, but in an instant more they were raised to his eyes and hung there, beaming with pride and love and happiness. This nerved and softened him at once, to even a gentler feeling towards the old man. Those lovely eyes had always looked trustingly and lovingly into her father's, and he would never disturb, so he vowed to himself, if he could avoid it by any sacrifice on his part, such filial and parental affection. And so, with gentler voice and softened mien, he went on speaking. Now I must ask you to believe, sir, that with the exception of that one fault, a grave one I admit, of taking Miss Ogilvy out alone in my motor, I have not willingly or consciously been guilty of any other disrespect towards you. You now understand, of course, that it was that unhappy assumed name which prevented my having the pleasure of visiting you and your family on this side of the Atlantic. No one can deplore more than I do that unhappy alias. The other, though I regret, and regret deeply, the pain it has caused, I cannot be sorry for, since it has been the means of making Joy my wife. Here he beamed down into the beautiful grey eyes of the said wife, who was still holding his arm. As he finished, she pinched gently the flesh of his arm. This sent a thrill through him. It was a kiss of sorts and had much the same effect as the real thing. Joy noted the change in his voice as he went on. I so respected your wishes, sir, that I did not actually ask in words Joy to be my wife until I should have obtained your permission to address myself to her. If you will look at that letter you will see that it was written at Sea and the Shale, my place in Rossshire, days before I posted it. Then if you did not ask her to marry you, how is it that you are now married, according to the sheriff? He thought this a poser, and beamed accordingly. Athlyne answered at once, when two people love each other, sir, as Joy and I do, speech is the least adequate form of expression. We did not want words, we knew. Again Joy squeezed his arm and they stood close together in a state of rapture. The Colonel, with some manifest hesitation, said, with regard to what the sheriff spoke of as real cause of scandal, was there? That, sir, said Athlyne, interrupting with as fierce and truculent an aspect as had been to the Colonel at any moment of the interview, is a subject on which I refuse to speak, even to you. Then after a pause he added, this I will say to you as her father, who is entitled to hear it. Joy's honor is as clear and stainless as the sunlight. Whatever has taken place has been my doing, and I alone am answerable for it. Whilst he was speaking, Joy stood close to him, silent and with downcast eyes. In the prolonged silence which ensued she raised them, and letting go Athlyne's arm stepped forward towards her father with flashing eyes. Father, what he says is God's truth. But there is one other thing which you should know, and you must know it from me since he will not speak. He is justified in speaking of my honor, for it was due, and due alone, to his nobility of character that I am as I am. That and your unexpected arrival. For my part I would have joy. Athlyne's voice, though the tone was low, rang like a trumpet. Half protest it was, half command. Instinctively the woman recognized the tone and obeyed, as women have obeyed the commands of the men they loved, and were proud to do so, from Eden Garden down the ages. Speak on, daughter. Finish what you were saying. His voice was strangely soft and his eyes were luminous beneath their shaggy white brows. Joy's answering tone was meek. I cannot, father. My Mr. Lord Athlyne desires that I should be silent. She was astonished at his reply following, well, perhaps he is right. Better so. Then in sotto voce to Athlyne, women should not be allowed to talk sometimes. They go too far when they get to self-abasement. Athlyne nodded. Again silence, which Colonel Ogilvy broke. Well, sir. I suppose we must take it that the marriage is complete in Scotch law. So far for the past. What of the future? In a low voice Athlyne replied, whose future? Yours and my daughter's. He was amazed at Athlyne's reply, spoken in a voice both low and sad. So too was Joy. Of that I cannot say. It does not rest with me. Not rest with you, sir. Then with whom does it rest? Athlyne raised his eyes and looked him straight in the face. With you. With me. The colonel's voice was faint with amazement. Yes, with you. What future?